In the spring of 2021, a wildlife biologist named Courtney Engel was conducting a routine survey of riparian habitat along the upper Cache la Poudre River corridor west of Fort Collins, Colorado, when she spotted something moving along the far bank that she initially categorized as a domestic cat. The animal was semi-submerged in the shallows, working the current in a way that suggested practiced familiarity with moving water. When it came to the near bank and she could see it clearly, she revised her identification. It was an American mink, Neovison vison, a sleek, dark-furred, semi-aquatic mustelid, roughly the size of a large squirrel, with the elongated body plan and fluid movement that distinguish the mustelid family from every other group of carnivores. She noted the observation in her field records and moved on. It was not, in isolation, a remarkable sighting. Mink are native to North America. They have always occupied appropriate habitat across a broad range. Seeing one along a Colorado mountain stream was not a reason to stop and ask questions. What made her stop and ask questions was what she saw over the next 4 months. Over the course of that summer, working the same general area in the course of fieldwork focused on other species, she documented mink on 3 additional occasions along the Poudre corridor, then twice along a tributary that fed into the main stem from the southwest. Then, in a single afternoon in late August, 5 separate animals in less than 2 miles of stream, including what appeared to be 2 juveniles moving together along the bank in the clumsy, exploratory way that suggests animals recently dispersed from a natal den. She had been conducting wildlife surveys along Colorado Front Range and mountain waterways for 11 years at that point. She had never seen 5 mink in a single afternoon. She called a colleague who worked farther south, along the Blue River drainage near Silverthorne, and described what she had seen. There was a pause on the phone. Her colleague said she had been seeing something similar for about 3 months and had not mentioned it because she did not yet know what to make of it. If you find these kinds of stories interesting, the ones that start with a single anomalous observation and open into something much larger and much stranger, then make sure you are subscribed. This is the kind of territory we cover here. The American mink has a complicated ecological history in North America, and understanding that history is necessary for understanding why its sudden apparent abundance in mountain Colorado waterways is not a simple story about a native species thriving in native habitat. The mink that most people picture when they think of the species is the ranch-raised variant, the one that was bred in captivity across North America and Europe for over a century to produce pelts for the fur industry. Those animals were selected for coat color, docility, reproductive rate, and a dozen other traits that suited commercial production, and they diverged from their wild counterparts in ways that are behaviorally and genetically measurable. Ranch mink were also, by the hundreds of thousands across the 20th century, escapees. Fur farms housed animals in wire cage enclosures that were breached by flooding, neglect, predation pressure on the farm perimeter, and deliberate releases by animal rights activists who raided facilities with the intention of liberating the animals. The history of escaped ranch mink in North America is long, poorly documented, and ecologically consequential in ways that have not been systematically studied. The wild-caught American mink, the one that occupies its historic range from the Atlantic coast to the Rockies and from the boreal forests of Canada to the Gulf Coast, is a different animal from its ranch counterpart in ways that matter ecologically. Wild mink are highly territorial, maintaining exclusive use of stream segments through aggressive scent marking and direct confrontation. They are dietary generalists, but heavily dependent on aquatic prey, primarily fish, crayfish, frogs, and water-associated small mammals, like muskrats and voles. They are sensitive to water quality and require structurally complex streamside habitat, with woody debris, undercut banks, and vegetative cover for denning. Their populations, in most of their historic range, have been relatively stable since the decline of commercial trapping pressure in the latter half of the 20th century, though they have not been systematically monitored in ways that would detect gradual range shifts or density changes at regional scales. They are not a species that generates routine attention from wildlife managers. They are not a game species in most states. They do not appear on most watch lists. They occupy the middle of a very long list of species that someone, somewhere, is nominally responsible for monitoring and that nobody is actively tracking on a landscape scale. This is part of why what is happening in Colorado mountain waterways is presenting itself as a mystery rather than as a documented ecological transition. The baseline data does not exist in the form that would allow a clean before and after comparison. There is no survey series from the 1990s or 2000s that mapped mink distribution and density along Colorado mountain streams with sufficient resolution to serve as a reference point for what is being observed now. What exists is the memory and direct experience of people who have spent significant time in those places: biologists, anglers, backcountry guides, long-tenure residents of the mountain towns that sit along these drainages, and the near-unanimous consensus among those people is that what they are seeing now is not what they saw 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 20. The mink were not there in these numbers. They may not have been there at all. The Colorado mountain towns at issue are not a geographically random sample. They cluster along specific drainages and at specific elevations in a pattern that suggests either a dispersal event moving up from lower elevation habitat along connected waterways, or multiple simultaneous establishment events across unconnected sites, or something else entirely that does not fit neatly into either of those frameworks. The towns and river corridors where concentrated mink observations have been reported in recent years include stretches of the Blue River between Silverthorne and Kremling, the Upper Eagle River near Vail, segments of the Frying Pan River above Basalt, the Crystal River corridor near Carbondale and Marble, portions of the Gunnison River drainage above Gunnison, and isolated reports from as far south as the Upper Rio Grande near Creede. These are not adjacent systems connected by continuous riparian corridors in all cases. The Blue River and the Frying Pan are separated by the Continental Divide. An animal moving between those drainages overland would need to cross terrain at high elevation that represents a significant barrier for a semi-aquatic mammal that depends on waterway structure for navigation and prey access. The pattern of the observations does not look like a single expanding population front radiating from a point of origin. It looks, to the people who have examined the data informally, more like a simultaneously emerging phenomenon across geographically distinct sites. That pattern is harder to explain. The fur farm history of Colorado is not extensive, but it exists. The state had a small number of commercial mink operations during the peak of the fur industry in the mid-20th century, concentrated primarily in the agricultural lowlands east of the Front Range and in the western slope valleys, with sufficient access to livestock-based resources for farm operation. Most of those operations closed during the industry's long decline from the 1970s onward, as the fur trade contracted under combined pressure from changing fashion and animal welfare campaigns. The fate of the animals at those operations at closure is not consistently documented. Some were euthanized. Some were sold to other farms. Some, inevitably, were released or escaped. Whether any of those animals or their descendants could account for feral populations in mountain drainages more than half a century later is a question that requires genetics to answer, and that nobody has yet put to a genetic test. The more recent fur farm history is more pointed. In 2013, an animal rights group conducted a raid on a small mink operation in a rural county on the western slope of Colorado and released what were later estimated to be between 800 and 1,200 animals. The farm operator reported the incident to law enforcement. A small number of animals were recovered in the days following the release. The remainder dispersed into the surrounding agricultural and riparian landscape. The incident received coverage in local and regional media for about a week and then faded from attention. The releases from that facility have never been formally connected to the mink populations now appearing in mountain waterways, and nobody has done the population genetics work that would either establish or rule out that connection. The geography is suggestive, but not conclusive. The drainage systems accessible from the release site connect, through a complicated series of valley corridors and tributary systems, to some, but not all, of the drainages where elevated mink observations are now being reported. Whether an escapee population from a single release event in 2013 could have dispersed widely enough and established breeding colonies at sufficient density to account for what is being seen across half the mountain waterways in Colorado a decade later is a question that population biologists who have looked at the informal data describe as plausible but not yet established. Then there is the question of the animals themselves. The behavioral characteristics of the mink being observed in Colorado mountain waterways have generated comment among several of the biologists and naturalists who have made sustained observations of them. Wild American mink are not typically bold animals. They are secretive, fast-moving, and reliably difficult to observe well, even in habitats where their signs, tracks, scent, prey remains are common. They retreat from human approach quickly and tend to use cover aggressively when moving through open terrain. The mink being observed along some of the Colorado mountain waterways have been described, in multiple independent accounts from people who do not know each other and who have made their observations in different drainages, as relatively indifferent to human presence, not habituated in the way of a truly domesticated animal, not approaching humans or soliciting interaction, but tolerating closer proximity than the behavioral literature would predict for a wild mink in intact habitat, and continuing foraging or movement behavior in the presence of human observers who have stopped and remain still within what should be the animal's normal flight distance. This behavioral characteristic, if it is real and not an artifact of observer bias or coincidence, is consistent with one of two explanations. The animals could be ranch origin or ranch-descended animals whose behavioral template for human avoidance was modified by generations of captive breeding for docility. Or they could be wild-type animals that have habituated to human presence in the heavily recreated stream corridors that constitute the mountain Colorado waterway environment, where human foot traffic and wading is frequent enough that animals without a strong avoidance response experience no consistent negative consequence from human proximity, and therefore do not select for or learn strong avoidance behavior. Both explanations are biologically plausible. Distinguishing between them requires morphological examination or genetic analysis of animals from the affected populations, neither of which has been conducted systematically. The ecological implications of mink population establishment or expansion in Colorado mountain waterways depend enormously on the scale and character of the populations involved, and those parameters are precisely the ones that are unknown. What is known about mink as predators in riverine and riparian ecosystems is extensive enough to be instructive. Mink are significant predators of stream fish, particularly juveniles of salmonid species. In rivers with established trout and salmon populations, mink predation on fry and juvenile fish can be ecologically relevant at the population scale under conditions of high mink density. The relationship between mink and salmonid populations has been studied most extensively in Great Britain, where escaped ranch mink established feral populations beginning in the 1950s and have been the subject of ongoing management controversy ever since, in part because of their documented predation on brown trout and Atlantic salmon in waterways that support important fisheries. The British situation is a natural experiment in what happens when a population of primarily ranch-origin mink establishes itself in a river system without prior mink occupancy, and the results are not entirely comforting from a fisheries perspective. Colorado mountain waterways are among the most important wild trout fisheries in the American West. The gold medal trout streams of Colorado, designated under a state management category that reflects exceptional wild fish populations and fishing quality, include a substantial number of the drainages where elevated mink observations are now being reported. The Frying Pan River, which produces wild rainbow and brown trout of exceptional size, sustained by specialized cold water habitat and managed catch-and-release regulations, is one of the most intensively managed and closely watched trout fisheries in the state. It appears on the list of drainages with recent elevated mink observations. The Blue River, below Dillon Reservoir, another designated gold medal fishery, is on the list. The significance of these overlaps is not established. Whether the mink populations in these drainages are dense enough and their fish predation intensive enough to register as a measurable impact on fish populations is unknown. Nobody has quantified the mink populations, modeled their predation impact, or initiated the monitoring program that would detect a fish population response over time. The fisheries managers responsible for these waterways are aware of the mink observations. They are not yet treating the situation as a management priority, requiring immediate action. That may be the appropriate response to an incompletely characterized situation. It may also be a response that will look, in retrospect, like an opportunity missed. The waterfowl dimension of the mink story in mountain Colorado is worth treating separately because it involves species that are more directly monitored and more politically salient than streamfish. American mink are significant predators of ground-nesting birds, and in riparian and wetland habitats, their impact on waterfowl nesting success can be substantial. In Britain, mink predation on mallard and other dabbling ducks nesting along riverbanks has been documented as a major driver of nest failure in areas of high mink density and conservation management of dipper populations, a small songbird strongly associated with fast-flowing streams and one of the more charismatic indicators of river ecosystem health, has been complicated in some regions by mink predation. The dipper, Cinclus mexicanus, the American dipper, is present along Colorado mountain waterways and is a species with which many of the biologists and naturalist observers who have been tracking the mink situation are familiar from their work on stream ecosystem health. Several of these observers have noted, informally and without the systematic data to support a causal claim, that dipper observations along some stretches of affected drainages have seemed qualitatively different in recent years. Whether that perception reflects a real change, observer bias, normal population fluctuation, or something with no connection to mink is entirely unknown. It is the kind of observation that is lost if nobody is paying attention, and that becomes important if it turns out to be the early signal of something real. American mink in Colorado mountain waterways would also encounter a native mustelid with which they share significant dietary and habitat overlap. The American marten, Martes americana, occupies boreal and subalpine forest habitat along the Colorado Rockies and uses riparian zones within its forested territory extensively. The mink and the marten are not direct competitors in most of their respective ranges, because their primary habitats are different enough, the mink being primarily aquatic, and the marten being primarily arboreal and forest floor associated. But in the zone where high-elevation conifer forest meets mountain waterway, which is exactly the terrain where the Colorado mink observations are concentrated, the dietary and spatial overlap is real enough to create interspecific, competitive dynamics. The marten has had a complicated population history in Colorado, having been nearly eliminated from the state by the early 20th century and subsequently reintroduced through translocation programs that began in the 1970s. It has recovered substantially across suitable habitat in the southern Rockies, but remains a species for which the state maintains management attention. Whether the emergence of a functionally significant mink population in mountain waterways creates competitive pressure on marten in the ecotonal habitat they share is again unknown. It is the kind of interaction that gets studied after it has already produced an impact, not before. The mink story in Colorado sits at the intersection of several broader ecological and conservation conversations that are playing out simultaneously across the American West, and that give the specific situation here a significance beyond its geographic scale. One of those conversations is about feral and escaped ranch animals, and the long tail of ecological consequence that fur farming has left across North American landscapes. The escaped ranch mink situation in North America has never received the sustained scientific and management attention that the British situation has, partly because North American mink are native, and partly because the distinction between wild-type and ranch-origin animals is not visible to the naked eye and requires genetic analysis to establish. This invisibility has meant that escaped ranch animals have been absorbed into the categories of the wild without generating the systematic response that would be triggered if the animals were visibly exotic. A population of mink along a Colorado river does not, at first look, announce whether it is wild origin or ranch origin. It looks like mink. It behaves mostly like mink. It is only in the subtle behavioral differences that observers like Courtney Engel notice, the relative tolerance of human proximity, the social grouping patterns that seem slightly denser than wild-type literature would predict, that the anomalies register. And those anomalies have to be noticed by someone paying close enough attention, which, in a landscape with no systematic mink monitoring program, is a very limited number of people. Another of those broader conversations is about the difficulty of detecting ecological change in real time, in complex natural systems, particularly changes in species whose populations are not actively monitored and whose significance is not apparent until after a threshold has been crossed. The Colorado mountain mink situation is, in its current state, a collection of observations from a scattered group of biologists, anglers, guides, and residents who are comparing notes informally through conversations and occasional social media exchanges rather than through any coordinated monitoring or reporting infrastructure. The Colorado Parks and Wildlife Agency, which would nominally have responsibility for documenting and managing the situation if it rose to the level of a management issue, has received some reports but has not designated the matter as a priority warranting systematic study. The academic community with relevant expertise has not mobilized around the question. The situation occupies the space that many early-stage ecological anomalies occupy. It is real enough to generate attention among people directly in contact with the affected landscape, not documented enough to cross the threshold of official recognition, and without a clear institutional home for the monitoring and research that would be needed to move from anecdote to analysis. The people most deeply embedded in the affected landscapes, the ones whose professional and personal lives bring them into sustained daily contact with these waterways, have developed their own theories about origin and trajectory, and those theories are interesting not because they are necessarily correct, but because they represent a kind of distributed ecological intelligence that the formal monitoring and management system is not currently capturing. Along the Frying Pan River, where the mink observations have been most consistent, and where a tight community of fishing guides and conservation-minded anglers maintains something close to continuous observation of the river ecosystem, the working theory that has circulated through that community for about 2 years centers on a specific event that several people independently connect to what they began noticing afterward. In the winter of 2018 and 2019, a period of exceptional flooding on multiple western slope drainages connected by the Colorado River system, several riparian corridor sections that are normally separated by terrain that discourages mink movement were connected by floodwaters that created temporary aquatic corridors across what are normally dry or minimally wet terrain features. The hypothesis, which has the status of a plausible speculative explanation rather than a documented mechanism, is that this flooding event allowed a dispersal across the watershed boundaries that would not have been possible under normal hydrological conditions, and that the animals that moved through those temporary corridors during the flood period colonized habitat in the upper drainages that they had not previously occupied. Whether any of this is true requires both the population genetics to show that the mountain waterway mink populations are related to specific source populations in lower elevation drainages, and the hydrological reconstruction to demonstrate that the flood period connectivity hypothesis is actually plausible given the specific terrain and water levels involved. Neither piece of work has been done. The theory lives in the informal knowledge network of people who care deeply about these rivers and who are trying to make sense of what they are seeing without the tools they would need to do so rigorously. The angler community's stake in this question deserves specific attention because it represents the most numerically significant and most organized constituency with direct interest in the outcome. Gold medal trout fishing in Colorado is not merely a recreational activity. It is an economic pillar of the mountain towns that sit along these waterways. The guide industry on the Frying Pan River and the Blue River represents tens of millions of dollars in annual economic activity. The fishing quality that sustains that industry depends on wild fish population dynamics that are sensitive to changes in predation pressure, habitat quality, and prey availability. Experienced guides who have spent years observing the fish populations on their home rivers describe a level of attention to ecosystem detail that is genuinely impressive and that constitutes a real source of ecological monitoring data, even if it is not collected in a form that feeds into formal scientific databases. When those guides say that something feels different about the way fish are holding in certain stretches, that pool utilization patterns are shifting, that surface feeding behavior in certain sections has changed in ways that suggest altered predation risk from below the water surface, as well as from above, they are making observations worth taking seriously even though they cannot be directly validated against controlled data. What is also worth noting is the specific geographic overlap between the stretches of these rivers where fish behavior anomalies have been anecdotally reported and the stretches where mink observation density has been highest. This overlap does not establish causation. It does not even establish correlation in any formal sense, because the observation records are too informal and too uncontrolled for statistical analysis. But the geographic correspondence is not random-looking to the people who know these rivers intimately. It is the kind of spatial pattern that, in a monitoring program with adequate data, would be the first thing you would want to look at. The question of genetic origin has come up in the context of the Colorado mink situation in a specific and interesting way that points toward one possible avenue for making progress on the origin question without a formal study. Several years ago, a wildlife genetics laboratory at a Colorado university began accepting tissue samples from mustelids taken in the course of various field research projects, with the intention of building a reference database of wild mustelid genetics in the Colorado Rocky Mountain region. The samples in that database include marten, weasels, and a small number of mink from the Front Range and the Western Slope. The database is not comprehensive, and it was not designed to address the specific question of ranch origin versus wild origin ancestry in mountain mink populations. But the reference samples that exist, combined with new samples from animals in the drainages where elevated observations are being reported, could theoretically allow a genetic comparison that would at minimum indicate whether the mountain waterway animals share ancestry with known ranch-type lineages or fall within the genetic range of wild-type Rocky Mountain mink populations. The laboratory has the capacity to conduct this analysis. The samples from the affected drainages have not been systematically collected. The project sits in the space where it would take one moderately funded research effort, probably achievable with a state wildlife research grant in the low tens of thousands of dollars, to produce data that would substantially clarify the situation. That effort has not materialized yet. Part of the reason it has not materialized is the institutional dynamic that shapes what questions get asked and by whom in wildlife science. The American mink is not a charismatic megafauna species. It does not generate the funding interest or the public attention that drives research on mountain lions, bears, wolves, or even the mid-tier game species with which most state wildlife agencies are primarily concerned. It is not endangered. It is not invasive in the sense that would automatically trigger regulatory attention from state or federal wildlife agencies, because it is native. It does not have a constituency that attends agency meetings, writes letters to legislators, or organizes around its management the way that elk hunters, fishing guides, or environmental groups concerned with listed species do. It is a small, semi-aquatic weasel relative that most people in the mountain towns where its populations are appearing have never seen, do not know to look for, and would not immediately recognize if they did see it. The ecological significance of what may be happening in Colorado mountain waterways is not self-announcing in a way that the institutional attention it would need to be properly characterized tends to respond to. The British experience with feral mink provides a detailed and extensively studied case that is genuinely instructive as a reference point, while also being different enough from the Colorado situation in specific ways that direct extrapolation has to be done carefully. In Britain, mink are not native. The feral populations that established themselves from escaped ranch animals beginning in the 1950s are invasive by definition. They encountered no ecologically functional native competition from a wild mink population, because there was none. The waterfowl and fish species they preyed on had no evolutionary history with a mink predator, and no co-evolved defensive behaviors or population dynamics calibrated to mink predation pressure. The ecological impact of mink in British river systems has been studied intensively over 7 decades, and the results include documented declines in breeding duck success, substantial impacts on water vole populations in some regions, and ongoing concerns about interactions with Atlantic salmon and sea trout rivers in Scotland. The British response has included long-running lethal control programs in some regions, including an interesting experiment with mink rafts, floating platforms with tracking pads that allow mink to be detected and trapped, that has been deployed at landscape scale in some Scottish river systems as a conservation intervention for seabird colonies and salmon rivers. In Colorado, the mink is native, which changes the framing substantially. A native species, appearing in greater numbers or in new portions of its historic range, is not, on its face, an ecological problem. It may be ecological recovery. It may be range expansion, facilitated by habitat change, climate-driven shifts in prey distribution, or the release of historical trapping pressure. Any of these would be unremarkable from a conservation perspective and potentially positive from a biodiversity perspective. The ranch origin possibility is what complicates this framing. because ranch-origin mink, even if they are the same species as the wild type, are functionally different animals in ways that their ecological impact may reflect. Their behavioral differences from wild-type animals, if the observed tolerance of human proximity reflects a genuine behavioral modification rather than simple habituation, could translate into different predation patterns, different territory use, different responses to management interventions. The genetic question is not merely academic. It is the fulcrum on which the appropriate management and conservation framing of the situation turns. There is also the climate dimension, which cannot be ignored when discussing distribution shifts in montane species in the Colorado Rockies in the 2020s. American mink are associated with specific water temperature regimes and specific prey assemblages in their core habitat. The cold, well-oxygenated, structurally complex streams of the Colorado Rockies have historically provided optimal mink habitat in terms of their biotic characteristics. The question is whether changing precipitation patterns, altered snowmelt timing, and the water temperature increases that are being documented in Colorado mountain streams are modifying those habitat characteristics in directions that favor or disfavor mink, and whether those changes are interacting with whatever dispersal or release dynamics are responsible for the current pattern of elevated observations. A mink population that establishes itself along a reach of river that is currently optimal habitat, but that is projected to warm and dewater over the next 2 or 3 decades, faces a very different long-term ecological trajectory than one establishing in habitat that is becoming more suitable under projected climate scenarios. The work needed to integrate the mink observation data with the water temperature and flow projection data for these specific drainages has not been done. It sits behind the same data and institutional barrier as everything else in this story. The mountain towns along these drainages are themselves an underappreciated part of the ecological context. The towns that sit along the Blue River Corridor, Silverthorne, Dillon, Frisco, Breckenridge, have grown substantially over the past 2 decades in ways that have changed the character of the riparian corridor running through and between them. Streamside development, bank modification for flood control and recreation access, changes in vegetation management, and the continuous presence of human activity along stream corridors have altered the habitat structure in ways that might favor animals that can tolerate human proximity over those that cannot. The hypothesis that the relative boldness observed in some of the Colorado mountain mink reflects not ranch ancestry, but habitat-selected tolerance of human presence, that these are genuinely wild animals that have learned through experience in heavily used recreational corridors that humans are not threats, has direct implications for how the populations in different drainages should be compared and characterized. An animal that has been selected for or has learned human tolerance in a town-adjacent riparian corridor might look behaviorally different from a ranch escapee, but show the same reduced flight distance to human observers. Distinguishing between these 2 mechanisms of human tolerance requires genetic analysis and behavioral study together, neither of which is currently available. The predator ecology of these mountain waterways is also relevant context. The primary natural predators of mink in their historic range are raptors, primarily great horned owls and red-tailed hawks, along with larger carnivores such as coyotes and bobcats that occasionally take them. In the high-elevation Colorado drainages, where the mink observations are concentrated, the predator community includes all of these, and also includes river otters, Lontra canadensis, which are apex semi-aquatic predators that recolonized Colorado waterways following a reintroduction program that began in the 1970s and that have established a self-sustaining population in many of the same drainages where mink are now being reported. The relationship between river otters and mink is complex. Otters do not routinely prey on mink, but they are much larger animals that are dominant to mink in competitive encounters over resources. And in waterway systems with healthy otter populations, mink tend to occupy different microhabitat niches than they do in otter-absent systems. Whether the presence of a recovering river otter population in Colorado mountain drainages acts as a check on mink population establishment or simply redistributes the mink within the available habitat is not documented for this specific system. It is the kind of interaction that would appear in a well-designed monitoring program as a spatial pattern in the distribution of the two species relative to each other. The absence of formal documentation does not mean the situation is not recognized. Within the relatively small community of biologists, naturalists, and land managers who spend sustained time on Colorado mountain waterways, the mink phenomenon has been a topic of informal conversation for at least 3 years. That conversation has the character that early signal ecological observations often take before they cross the threshold of formal scientific attention. People are sharing what they have seen. They are comparing notes. They are developing hypotheses. They are expressing varying degrees of concern, ranging from none, primarily from those who view native species range expansion as unremarkable and positive, to significant, primarily from those who are familiar enough with the British mink situation and with the sensitivity of gold medal trout fisheries to understand what a functionally significant mink population expansion could mean for fish populations that are already stressed by warming water and changing hydrology. The conversation is happening without the data that would allow it to be resolved, and without a clear institutional pathway for generating that data. One of the more interesting aspects of the situation is the role that fishing guides have played in surfacing it as a phenomenon worth attention. Guides on the Frying Pan River in particular, a community that is small, cohesive, and deeply invested in the long-term ecological integrity of the river they work, have been the most consistent source of mink observations and the most vocal in expressing the view that something unusual is happening. Several of them have begun keeping informal logs of mink sightings during guided trips, noting date, location, number of animals, and behavioral observations. These logs are not scientific data in any rigorous sense. They are not collected on a standardized protocol, they are not statistically representative, and they are subject to the observer variability and bias that characterizes all informal natural history records. But they represent a longitudinal record of observations from people who spend more hours per year observing this specific stretch of river than any scientist has, and the trend they show toward more frequent, more numerous, and geographically more widespread mink observations over the period from roughly 2018 to the present is consistent across multiple independent observers. The guides have also been the primary source of observations that speak to the reproductive status of the animals. Several independent observations of apparent family groups, a female with multiple juveniles moving along the bank or foraging in shallow water together, have been made along the Frying Pan corridor and along the Crystal River to the west. Reproductive family groups indicate not just presence, but established breeding, which is qualitatively different from transient individuals moving through. An animal moving through unfamiliar territory in the process of dispersal looks different from a resident female with a recent litter. The family group observations suggest that whatever colonization process brought mink to these drainages has progressed beyond initial establishment to self-sustaining reproduction, which changes the management and ecological significance of the situation substantially. The self-sustaining reproduction point is where the trajectory of the situation becomes most important to characterize correctly, because it determines the time frame within which a thoughtful response is possible and the range of management options that remain open. A recently arrived, not yet reproducing population of uncertain origin can be monitored, studied, and if warranted, managed through a range of interventions before it has produced the ecological impact that a self-sustaining, reproducing population would eventually generate. A self-sustaining population that has been present long enough to establish territory and produce multiple cohorts of offspring is a fundamentally different management situation. The window for the first scenario may still be open in some of the affected drainages. It may have closed in others. Without systematic survey data, it is impossible to know which drainages are at which stage of the process. What the situation in Colorado mountain waterways ultimately illustrates is something important about the general problem of ecological monitoring and early detection in complex natural systems managed by institutions with limited resources, competing priorities, and no particular incentive to chase down anomalies that have not yet risen to the level of documented impacts. The American mink is appearing in mountain Colorado waterways in patterns and numbers that are genuinely anomalous relative to the recent historical record of the species in these systems. The origin of those populations is uncharacterized. The population dynamics, density, and reproductive status are unknown. The ecological relationships between these populations and the fish, waterfowl, and other wildlife of the affected drainages have not been studied. The trajectory of the situation over the next decade is entirely unconstrained by data, and the institutional machinery that would normally respond to an ecological anomaly of potential conservation significance has not engaged, because the species involved is small, native, not charismatic, not currently threatening anything that has a politically active constituency, and because nobody who has the formal authority to respond has yet been presented with a body of evidence that triggers the threshold response. This is how many consequential ecological changes begin, not with a dramatic event that demands immediate attention, not with a species that arrives displaying obvious alien characteristics and causing visible damage to things that people care about on a timescale short enough to register in the human attention span. They begin with observations by people who spend enough time in specific places to notice that something is different, who share those observations informally, and whose signals struggle to find the institutional pathway that would allow them to be properly characterized and responded to. Sometimes those signals turn out to reflect transient fluctuations that resolve without intervention. Sometimes they are the early indicator of a process that, by the time it has generated enough impact to trigger formal attention, has progressed well past the point where early intervention would have been most effective. The Colorado mountain mink situation is not yet clearly one of those two things. It could still be either. Courtney Engel, the biologist who made the initial observation along the Poudre corridor in 2021, has spent parts of the intervening years trying to interest colleagues and managers in a formal study of the situation. She has given informal presentations at state wildlife conference sessions. She has written emails to program managers at Colorado Parks and Wildlife. She has shared her observation records with fisheries biologists who work the affected drainages. She describes the response as interested, but not urgent. People who hear what she has seen express genuine curiosity. They ask good questions. They do not express skepticism about her observations. They also do not mobilize the institutional resources that would be needed to move from curiosity to study. The study that would answer the most important questions, the genetic origin analysis, combined with systematic population surveys and dietary analysis across multiple affected drainages, is not a large or expensive research program by the standards of what gets funded in wildlife science. It is the kind of project that could be completed in 2 to 3 field seasons with a small team and a modest grant. The data it would produce would either confirm that something unusual and potentially consequential is happening in these waterways, or establish that the observations reflect normal population variation within a species that has never been systematically monitored well enough to know what normal looks like. Either result would be valuable. Neither is available. The mountain towns along the Blue River and the Frying Pan and the Crystal River will continue to grow. The waterways running through and adjacent to those towns will continue to be used intensively for fishing, kayaking, trail running, and general recreation. The mink will continue to do whatever mink do in situations like this, which is to say, they will continue to forage, reproduce, compete for territory, interact with the fish and waterfowl and other species they share the water with, and occasionally be observed by the people on the banks who are paying enough attention to notice them. The questions their presence raises about origin, about ecology, about the management of a native species in a situation that may not be ecologically equivalent to native range occupancy, will continue to accumulate without answers as long as the observations stay in the informal network of field biologists, fishing guides, and naturalists who are currently carrying the story. What would change the situation is attention, not alarm, not a management response calibrated to a threat that has not yet been characterized, but the kind of sustained, systematic scientific attention that a genuinely interesting and unresolved ecological question deserves, conducted with the rigor and the resources that would allow the informal signal being generated by the people who know these rivers to be translated into the kind of formal knowledge that the institutional system can act on. The mink are there, more of them than there used to be, in places where they may not have been before, behaving in ways that are slightly but consistently anomalous relative to the behavioral baseline of their species. Nobody knows why, and nobody yet knows what it means. Those are exactly the kinds of questions that deserve to be taken seriously before the situation has progressed far enough that the answers become obvious from their consequences rather than from the careful work of people paying close attention at the right time. The rivers that run through the Colorado mountains are among the most ecologically significant and most intensively studied in the American West, and a small, dark, fast-moving animal that almost nobody is watching is writing a chapter in their ecological history that nobody is yet reading clearly enough to understand.